this is the panel about corruption and impunity in God's name. As the name of the session suggests, we are going to be focusing on the topic of religious groups and the different standards that they have for reporting or not financial information, and what this means when it comes to anti-corruption. So let me introduce the panelists that we have today very briefly. We will start with Ann Nelson, who is an author of the book, The Shadow Network, which deals with media, money, and the secret hub or the radical right. And she will describe for us some of the decentralized way in which very organized groups have been working and the risks that this pose for dark money going into political finance. We have Giannina Segnini as well. She is the director of the Master of Science Data Journalism at the Journalism School in Columbia University. She is also a co-founder of the Latin American Center for Investigative Journalism. She has done extensive investigations across the region on religious groups and corruption. We also have Pete Evans. He's the president of the Trinity Foundation. This is an NGO of a religious inclination, and one of their focus is basically investigating fraud and other corruption forms in religious organizations in the US, though I think sometimes their work also touches on different countries as well. And then finally, we have Shruti Shah. She is the president and CEO of the Coalition for Integrity. They do a lot of work on political finance and other areas, and she also has experience as a forensic investigator, which can be, I think, very useful for our discussion today. So we will have presentations from each one of the panelists, and then we are going to have a discussion with a few questions here, but we also want to hear from you, and also what brings you here, right? And perhaps from your countries, if wherever you're coming from, you also have some information or to share about how these issues are developing there. So without any further ado, Anne, please go ahead, and hopefully the presentation will work.
Yes, we do hope that. Is the microphone on? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, we can. Okay, I used to teach a 9 o'clock class for international students who were Friday morning, Columbia University, and everybody was pretty sleepy by then. So I found that if I used images and moved around, it woke them up a little. You're at the end of the day, and I do have compassion. So I'm talking today about the subject of my most recent book. I had been involved in international affairs for my entire career, and then around 2016, November 3rd to be precise, I became concerned about my own country and what was happening to our democracy. I began to research this subject very seriously, and I found that when funding progressive democratic projects in this country, and probably in others, it's like a kindergarten class where all the kids are saying, me first, me first, me first, right? And with the right-wing organizations, it was like a machine. You're going to do research, you're going to do focus groups, you're going to do strategy, you're going to implement it, and my goodness, it worked so much better. It was like a corporation. And I found that a lot of the activist groups that I was studying came together in meetings at something called the Council for National Policy, which is designed to sound really boring, but it's not. So these are the goals of the funders and the people who are involved in the Council for National Policy. First, they want to take over the political process, and they do that through their work to undermine elections and to stack the federal judiciary, the judges, with people they support and who will rule in their favor on these basic cases. They want to roll back women's rights to abortion, and their absolute goal is to eliminate all abortions in the United States, even very early term. And some of them even say they want to eliminate birth control. Also, they want to roll back marriage equality and other rights for LGBT citizens, including denial of service. So if you happen to be a gay person who asks for, say, a wedding cake for your marriage, they can deny it to you because you are against their religion. which is not how we think about civil rights in the past in this country. Finally, follow the money. They want to roll back environmental and climate regulations that are costly to fossil fuel industries. You'll find the Koch brothers involved in this, not as religious advocates, but as corporate greed. And in order to do this, they want to cut taxes for corporations and extremely wealthy Americans, and cut social programs, public schools, public health, cut the budgets across the board for the rest of the population. How do they do this? Well, I broke them into three groups. The fundamentalists, here's a member of the Council for National Policy, Mrs. Clarence Thomas. She is president of something called the Liberty Council, and she is on the 501c4 of the Council for National Policy, which means that she is both a member of the nonprofit tax-exempt group and the group that can be politically active, and she has been politically active. She works closely with Charlie Kirk, another member of the CNP, who organized a youth organization called Turning Point USA. And recently, Charlie got religion, so he organized Turning Point Faith. So he goes into churches making political speeches across the country. At a CNP meeting, Ginny Thomas presented this slide showing how they intended to undermine the left, build their own infrastructure, protect their heroes and President Trump. And in fact, that's what they've done. She helped to orchestrate the January 6th protest. She sent tweets and emails to President Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, trying to overturn the election. And she's been invited to talk to the January 6th committee. She was actively in touch with members of the legislatures in various states trying to overturn their elections. Now, Charlie was even more involved. He sent some buses full of students to January 6th. He didn't send 80, that was an exaggeration. He did send several hundred students through his organization. Remember, there's a lot of nonprofit money going into these groups. That means that they're tax exempt because they're not supposed to be politically partisan, but they are. You have the Alliance Defending Freedom, another member of the CNP here. They're now arguing before the Supreme Court to restrict LGBT rights in terms of the court case. It's called the 330 case. And it's a kind of a pseudo case where a woman says she may start a website, and if she does, and if some gay people come and want her to do a website for their wedding, does she need to do it? It's a bogus case. There's no plaintiff. There's nobody who's proven harm. It's a case that's being brought before this court because they're expecting the most favorable possible decision. So all of the groups involved in this have some kind of connection to something called the National Christian Foundation. Now, as of 2017, this was the 8th largest nonprofit in the United States. You've got billions of dollars coming through this organization. Their 2019 tax return shows them having $1.36 billion in grants and $2.6 billion left as assets. You have them funding the Alliance Defending Freedom, the group that's before the Supreme Court today at $6.5 million. Turning Point USA with Charlie Kirk. Ginny Thomas was on his board. The Federalist Society, which you'll hear more about. It's a group that gave Trump the list of nominees for the Supreme Court that were to be approved and were indeed appointed. And Americans for Prosperity, founded by David Koch. So what we're seeing is a lot of interwoven funding into activist groups, much of it's tax exempt. You have also on their filing grantees. This is just Africa. Every line in that represents a group that they're funding in Africa, and you're going to see the same kind of policies imposed on those cultures. And you have situations where anti-LGBT legislation and measures are being brought and furthered and financed in Africa, as well as Latin America. I am going to tweet a copy of this document after I finish, if anybody wants to go into the details and see whether there's anything interesting about their countries on it. So here you have a private foundation, the Bradley Foundation. Here's another member of the Council for National Policy, Richard Graber. And they have funded election denial and other measures that work within these three goals. You also have the DeVos and Prince family foundations. Now, Betsy DeVos was our Secretary of Education, who did her best to cut funding for public schools in the United States. She was basically the anti-Secretary of Education. So this is her mother, Elsa Prince Brookhuizen. Her father-in-law and mother-in-law were active with it as well. They're major donors for many of these groups. They have a combined fortune of $8 to $10 billion and many, many different foundations. So that was basically the Protestant fundamentalist and evangelical funding network in a teacup. These are the Catholics. Now, Leonard Leo is a name that everybody should know. He's active with Opus Dei. He was the vice president of the Federalist Society and was the most instrumental person giving a list of approved judges to Trump as part of the deal for getting his backing from the Council for National Policy and related groups. So again, anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ+, and pro-big business, pro-cut taxes for the ultra-wealthy. So he now, as of 2020, heads the Marble Freedom Trust. He got a single grant from a wealthy man named Barry Seid that gave him $1.6 billion in assets overnight with a stroke of a pen. And he soon gave himself $153 million from the Marble Freedom Trust for his Rule of Law Trust, where he's the sole trustee. And he uses this to promote the appointment of conservative Catholic judges. Now, I want to remind you that the Catholic population of the United States is only 23%. And not all of those Catholics are conservative by a long shot. But now you have the majority of judges on the US Supreme Court, 5 out of 9, who are conservative Catholics. This is not representative of our social norms. This is not representative of our public. This is a political and economic machination. And now he has another project that he advises and helped to found called the Honest Elections Project, which underwrites all kinds of challenges to elections and promotion of Trump's big lie. Okay, now the third tranche, the Coke machine. This is Lawson Bader. He's the president of Donors Trust and Donors Capital Fund. This is another massive dark money operation. Now, what we mean by dark money is it's called a donors advised fund. So if you are sitting on an extra $1 billion and you want to give it to some kind of conservative project, you can send it into this fund, and there are no fingerprints. People don't track who you are and what you're funding. Both the Democrats and the Republicans have them, but I would say that the networking of the Donors Advised Fund among the Republicans is 50 times more sophisticated and more effective than anything the Democrats are doing. So look at the Donors Trust. They received nearly $1 billion in dark money in 2021. Well, their grantees include, in 2019, the Federalist Society. Oh, wait, the Federalist Society is what Leonard Leo was running. I remember them. Leonard Leo, the Opus Dei Catholic. Turning Point USA. Oh, that's Charlie Kirk and Ginny Thomas. They're getting money from the Koch operation, too. And the Americans for Prosperity Foundation, which was founded by David Koch. So one hand washes the other. One hand washes itself. The hand washing goes on and on in this perpetual ring cycle. But they also receive contributions from the DeVos Urban Leadership Foundations, which is the DeVos and the Prince families. Oh, $6.5 million, that's a tag sum. And the Bradley Foundation, right? We just heard about them, and the National Christian Foundation. So one thing that's interesting about this is that the Donors Trust and the Donors Capital Fund were founded with Koch support, and the Kochs have never been religious. In fact, as libertarians, they're pretty much laissez-faire about most social issues, and I, after 5 years of research, never found a single indication of any religious spirit on any of their parts, but they're woven into this funding and activist cycle. So today, Washington, D.C., as we sit here, the Supreme Court has been considering this case called Moore versus Harper. It involves gerrymandering, rigging electoral districts in North Carolina so that the Republicans win the state even if a majority of people in North Carolina vote for Democrats. That's how it's set up. And it also is connected to something called the state legislature doctrine, which would mean that the state legislatures, the majority of which have been Republican, will be able to elect the president regardless of the popular vote. Clearly an anti-democratic measure. We don't know how it's going to come out. If you look at the New York Times and the Washington Post today, they will call this one of the greatest crises our democracy has faced. So we have $89 million going to groups that have filed amicus briefs. That means briefs that are in favor of the anti-democratic means and are seeking to influence the Supreme Court justices with their arguments. So where is this money coming from? Oh, well, Donors Trust chipped in $6 million, and you have more money from the Donors Capital Fund, the Bradley Foundation Fund that I mentioned earlier. So they're working, as I said, as a coordinated, well-oiled machine back to achieve these three goals: consolidate power through the electoral process and the federal judiciary, subverting the will of the Democratic voters, rolling back the rights of women and LGBT people that have been hard fought for decades and achieved in the rule of law, rolling them back regardless. As it happens, the majority of Americans believe that women should have some abortion rights, and they believe that there should be the right for marriage equality. That doesn't matter to them. Roll back the environmental and climate regulations that our world needs to preserve our planet, that our world desperately needs in order to squeeze out more dollars of corporate profit and to cut their own taxes and to leave the children of the United States without public health and without education, without a future. So if you want to pursue this subject further, I have some resources here: Dismog Blog, Accountable, Center for Media and Democracy, True North Research, ProPublica Nonprofit Explorer. There are many more, and I'm happy to address emails if you have questions. I won't be reachable for the next 10 days, but after that, feel free to write to me at my email address. And I post a lot of updates on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And Giannina, tell us about Latin America.
Hello, everybody. So I've been an investigative reporter for the last 30 years, mostly covering corruption and organized crime, first in Costa Rica and then internationally with the ICIJ, and currently teaching at Columbia. And I also run a cross-border investigation team that we hire 3 journalism students after they graduate to work exclusively full-time in cross-border investigation. So some years ago, I never, and to be honest, never had to, religion was not part of anything that I did in my life, and I never thought that I was gonna be involved in this, honestly. But back in 2017, we started seeing, and now it's more known, how in different countries, not just in Latin America, but in the global South in general, how religion, and specifically, I mean, certain groups supported by US groups and international groups were really influencing politics at the highest level in Latin American countries. So I'm going to talk about 2 separate investigations. I mean, they are technically separate, but one led to the other one. So we started first looking into, that influence, and pretty much created a database of all the groups from any place influencing directly in politics in Latin America. So we started with most of the groups that ADF and most of the groups you mentioned, they all have sent lots of money, not just to Latin America, but Africa. I mean, in general, the global South. Jamaica, for instance, is an example of a country that, I don't know if the number is updated, but Jamaica has more churches per capita than any other country in the world. And some of these churches receive money from these foundations to literally suppress the rights of LGBTQ communities. And so we started looking into how that agenda is concretely, not in abstract terms. I read, I don't know, like 28 books. Scholars have been writing about this for years. But it turns out that journalists, we do not cover religion. And when I started with this idea, I myself was confused. I don't know what I'm looking for. So we developed a methodology to sort of create a database of all these groups and see what they were doing. So our partners, we worked with 16 partners in 16 countries in Latin America for the first investigation, and we were able to identify multiple groups, but we focused primarily in two groups. One is really important for the US because this is during the Trump administration. So there's an office at the White House that it's the Faith and Opportunities Initiative, the office in the White House that during the Obama and other administrations has served as a bridge between the faith community and the White House. But Trump appointed around 40 all of them evangelical fundamentalist leaders in that office. And they were all traveling across the world, promoting and influencing. One of these members, a group of them went to Brazil, to help and campaign on favor of Bolsonaro during the elections. And so we started seeing all these connections that were literally very close connections between the church leaders in the countries. And then we identified the White House pastor, Ralph Drollinger, who was brought into the White House by Pence. And I mean, we were able to prove how in a bilateral meeting between Pence and Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who is now in prison for money laundering, and who was one of the favorite presidents of the Trump administration. In one bilateral meeting in the White House, Pence is convincing Juan Orlando to set up a minister in the presidency and Congress in Honduras, and that Drollinger, the pastor, was going to leave. So Drollinger, and then after we discovered that, we started mapping all the work of this ministry. In even Daniel Ortega, who is now also using, he brought Drollinger to inaugurate a mission in the presidency. So that political part was, or investigation led us to publish a series, and the stories are incredible from 16 countries in Latin America. Transnationals of Faith is the name of the investigation. You can, Transnacionales de la Fe in Español. And but during that investigation, and this is how, during that investigation, because we were mapping people and like creating graph databases of all these players, so we started, when we looked at the local religious leaders, we noticed that there were already 7 of them who were also investigated on money laundering and financial crimes. So we published this investigation that basically described how even during official meetings, just to give you another example, we didn't publish this, but we were tracking all the trips that this group was doing. And only 1 month after Khashoggi was killed, 20 evangelical leaders went to visit MBS in Saudi Arabia. The pattern was not just here and abroad, was they were serving as a sort of invisible diplomats force. I know that this is not new and was not invented by this administration or any other one. But let me focus on the second part, because that's where I think is the one that is more related to what we're talking about here, and it's literally organized crime and churches. So that's how we started. It's so difficult for a journalist or for anybody to investigate money laundering, because unless a judge classifies that thing as money laundering, you cannot even suggest it, even having the evidence. So we thought, why not using technology? We started, accessing different databases and manually collecting court cases from all the countries in the continent. So we covered the US, Canada, and Latin America. And what we were looking for were criminal cases involving churches and money laundering. So we collected more than 200 cases, and the idea was finding patterns, trying to understand how is it that they... So one of the first patterns we found is, first of all, that those cases were found by law enforcement by accident in most of the cases. So either they were investigating a drug smuggling operation, and then they ended up arresting a pastor, or they were, but none of the cases except two that were huge. One here in the U.S., a Mormon sect that embezzled $1 billion from U.S. tax credits in Utah. That was one of the huge cases, and so they were operating with intermediaries that were connected to organized crime. In all of the cases, the connection is direct, and we started to see. Of course, this data collection is not representative, because starting with the fact that there is zero proactive effort that I have seen, at least. And we made sure that we talked to everybody. And of course, the Trinity Foundation, they were really, really helpful on helping us understand this. But none of the cases was investigated because of a proactive action of law enforcement or nobody. But once you see the cases, there are common denominators. Most of the churches involved or investigated money laundering are they don't have a denomination, a religious denomination, because it's easier to set up. Just to give you an example, we actually created the Church of Journalism during the investigation. We wanted to see, how easy. Let's see. We created the Church of Journalism, and here in the U.S., you don't need to register a church. So let me tell you what happens in reality. You don't need to register a church unless you want tax exemption. So if you want to have tax exemption, then you file for a 501c3, and then you get the. But you don't need to register. You go to a clerk, and in less than half an hour, you become a church. And that, of course, has been exploited, and the zero regulation, the IRS is totally, we talked to many former IRS officials who told us that there is zero investigation on these kind of operations. So all across the different sectors, including journalism, and I have to say, when I started calling colleagues in all of those countries, there's like, what's wrong with you? Religion has never been a topic. It's a taboo. And the moment, and then when we started talking to prosecutors and experts who have been doing this systematically, because they have been very smart on using religious freedom as a shell. So if you start investigating anything involving religion, it's seen as an attack of religious freedom. And I think that has been a serious problem, and we can talk about this later in our conversation, because for sure my co-panelists have so much to say about this. But going back to the patterns, international churches. Just imagine churches in Colombia, Brazil, even El Salvador, and Guatemala. International churches that had, with headquarters in Guatemala, with 1,000 branches all over the world. And they call themselves international churches. Those are more really, I mean, what they built is and later on, we discovered that it was not, one of the questions we had is like, how does it happen? Is it that organized crime approach religious people to engage in this kind of crime, or the other way around? And yes, there's a little bit of everything, but there's the worst scenario is El Cartel del Golfo, the Gulf Cartel in Colombia, which is one of the worst, most violent cartels, drug cartels in Colombia, deliberately created a network of churches. So there is a group of churches created for the sole fact, the only mission of laundering money. So this particular case was, they were convicted, but again, it was a coincidence. So two of these pastors, they were sent to the Dominican Republic, these pastors, and their mission was using the church as a front, receiving money, depositing money, and also buying real estate, which is that's another pattern that we found. Real estate in New York City, in Miami. I mean, all the Latin American leaders have expensive properties in Florida, Miami, and so real estate is another pattern, and how they use properties and move properties. Loans is another, and trusts. And in terms of how, of course, I mean, there was a range of cases from, and this is a crazy anecdote, a pastor in Brazil who was coming to the U.S. with his family, and he was arrested after he was carrying a backpack, and it fell and it opened. It was full of bills, money, and so the entire family, they were literally carrying cash. So there are a bunch of cases like that, like a woman who created the Church of Sex and set up a bunch of literally accounts all over the country connected to one account. And in reality, I don't want to overwhelm you with the cases. You can go and check the publications. But the reality is that a pastor in Argentina comes on Monday with $500,000 in cash to the bank and deposits this money, and nobody can say anything about that. I mean, this is the money I got during the weekend's collection, This is the donations of the weekend. So, and there's pretty much nothing to do in terms of, then we looked at the regulation, and I'm pretty sure, I'm not an expert, and my co-panelists know more about this, but we created like a matrix of all these countries and what kind of regulation has been implemented, and in most of the cases is none. Churches do not have to register. They do not have to report any kind of financial or operative information to authorities. And when that happens, it's actually seen as an attack. But probably that's why governments and regulators are reluctant. But in general, there's a whole cloud of resistance or reluctance on investigating this kind of crime. And then, for instance, the 990s, they just do not report and nothing happens. That's a minor thing, and they don't get investigated. There's an emblematic case in Africa that I want to talk about, because I think it shows how bad this can get in our societies. The mix and this intersection of politics, religion, and crime. 3 pastors, among the cases we investigated in Guatemala, we had 3 pastors who became the maximum power in their communities. San Marcos in Guatemala, the pastor was the mayor, the pastor, and everything. So it's a concentration of power that, and the connection with politics is it's absolute, especially in local communities. And so these people were arrested because they were also, they were the narcos, the pastors, and the mayors of those communities. So it's a triple, it shows the connection of the intersection of how, and that's why, I always say that we journalists should continuously look at what these leaders are doing, because they're really influencing. In Africa, there's a pastor called Bushiri. He's 30-something years old. He's from Malawi, and he came to South Africa, and he created a church that became immediately very popular. More than 500,000 people, according to his records, follow the church. So he has an airline in Dubai. He owns an oil trade company in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. He's and many more assets. He was arrested 3 years ago with his wife, and when he was in prison, I don't know for certain the number of people, but the people went to the streets and they were about to destroy the court. And they had to release this guy, and now he's on the run because he never came back. But the example, when I saw the images of all these religious people, going against the court, against the system to defend the pastor, because the mechanisms that they use to attract people, of course, have to be with money and opportunities. But it's a very complex situation and they, of course, know how to work with the most vulnerable people in those countries. So this network of narco pastors in Dominican Republic, they were expanding their operations all over the Caribbean. And creating networks, and this is important because they don't work alone. They create networks of companies. And so why do they build these huge churches? That's another symptom. Because if you have a church, mega church, then you have room for 3,000 people if you're asked, some of these churches, they claim that they get 3,000 people every session. So they can perfectly hold 10,000 people during the weekend, even if it's not happening. And that's what they use to justify the amounts of money flowing in the financial sector. The last thing we heard when we were ending the investigation is that now they are creating cryptocurrencies to avoid the financial sector, especially, and we were able to track a couple of them, especially tied to religious organizations, and so I think that's another field. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Giannina. Pete, you have done a lot of investigation as well into churches, so please tell us your adventures and what you have found.
All right. Is this on? Yeah, this is on. I'm going to speak here from the podium. And thank you, Giannina. We did work with you, with Beatriz and your organization for a while to help expose religious fraud and in Latin America. I'm going to see. Well, let me go ahead and work with my computer here for a moment. All right. Is this one live now? Okay, thank you. I'm Pete Evans. In the program, I'm John Evans. Everybody has always known me as Pete, president of Trinity Foundation in Dallas, Texas. And we've been investigating and exposing religious fraud for 3 decades now, and I've been a licensed private investigator for most of that time. I've also worked undercover in ministries and religious organizations for months at a time on four different occasions for our investigations. We regularly provide information to journalists and to government agencies such as the Exempt Organization Division of the IRS, which tends to be a black hole. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But the problem is that there's a veil of financial secrecy, as you've been hearing from the other panelists, with that shrouds and hides religious organizations. So we know that looking around that there are a lot of decent small churches around the world that do good work, but that help the poor, the needy, the stranger, the immigrant, the migrants. But the problem with the dark money is that people who have a veneer and a pretense of religion, a pretense of religiosity, can hide their money. In a sense, the religious right that and Nelson has been investigating thoroughly, they have a huge support among large megachurches and televangelists here in the United States. So churches, synagogues, mosques, and other religious entities in America don't have to report any financial information, either to the IRS, the public, or their congregations. And any financial transparency is only voluntary. So we've seen this veil of secrecy lead to massive waste and extravagance, money laundering, bulk cash smuggling, a tremendous indifference to the poor and downtrodden, and even rape, pedophilia, sex trafficking by pastors, priests, televangelists, and other church leaders, huge church leaders, all in the name of God. That's what sickens me. It's all in the name of God, as this particular the title of this particular program is about. So, and just as an aside, one organization we investigated in 2009, the Luz del Mundo, based in Guadalajara, Mexico. Their leader, when he landed in Los Angeles, he was arrested immediately for sex trafficking, pedophilia, rape, and after 2 years, he's finally in prison. His name is Nason Joaquin Garcia. And he's finally in prison. But there's another huge church leader. These are leaders that have millions of followers around the globe. There's another church that has millions of followers, and his leader is on the most wanted list by the FBI now for the same charges that Nason Joaquin Garcia was convicted of here in the U.S., and that his name is Apollo Quibeloy. Apollo Quibeloy. His personal jet was detained in Honolulu about 3 years ago for bulk cash smuggling But one of his followers took the fall for him and said, "Okay, that's my money. Those hundreds of thousands of dollars are mine, not my leaders." And so now he's in the Philippines. Anyway, I'm gonna keep going here because I could go a long time on that. In 2007, cumulative reports from Trinity Foundation spurred Senator Charles Grassley of the U.S. Senate Finance Committee to begin investigating religious fraud and self-dealing by requesting financial records from and threatening numerous subpoenas to 6 prominent media ministries. The threat of public testimony into abuses of the tax code before the Senate scared the televangelists and heads of religious denominations. So what became of the inquiry? The Senate probe caused a momentary spike in awareness, but was largely ignored in the United States media, and investigation eventually went nowhere. One of several reasons for the Senate's failure to act was that the televangelists being investigated combined their resources to hire lawyers, lobbyists, and social media experts. And as Giannina explained earlier, the whole investigation, the inquiry, was framed as an attack against the church, which it was never about that, of course. It was not about religious persecution at all. It was about the misuse and extravagant waste of donor money. So what will it take to bring a wake-up call for transparency to religious organizations? In 2008, Trent Huddleston, a former accountant at Oral Roberts University, which is America's university of choice for Pentecostals and Charismatics, he sued the university for discharging him after 15 months of intimidation and harassment. Huddleston alleged that university officials ordered him to cook the books, but buried on page 4 of the lawsuit was the most serious allegation. More than $1 billion flowed annually through an unrestricted account, which should have spurred on an army of investigative reporters to follow the money, but nothing came of it. Aside from a couple of articles in the Tulsa World, journalists failed to explore the scandal. And buried in government documents, inaccessible to journalists, there may exist what are called suspicious activity reports. Remember that the acronym is SARS, S-A-R-S. To verify allegations of money laundering at Oral Roberts University and prominent Christian media ministries. Financial institutions are required to file currency transaction reports when a person deposits or withdraws $10,000 or more dollars in cash. When individuals attempt to avoid reporting requirements by making multiple deposits or withdrawals in a short amount of time, this is often called structuring. Financial institutions are required to file these suspicious activity reports, the SARS. But unfortunately for investigative reporters, people in this room, private investigators like us, the Bank Secrecy Act prohibits the release of these reports to the public. Additional allegations of massive money laundering involving religious organizations have surfaced with little media attention. On May 3, 2000, the United States was preparing for a possible indictment of televangelist Benny Hinn. Many of you have probably heard of him. He's kind of passing from the public eye now, but been popular over the past 20 or 30 years. They were preparing to indict him 22 years ago for money laundering when the government's main witness that we knew and was helping us with our investigations, he died of a suspicious heart attack. Benny Hinn Ministries obtained a protective order to prevent disclosure of critical information. But sometimes there are legal ways to obtain the truth. A Freedom of Information Act request, called by its acronym called a FOIA, F-O-I-A, FOIA request, to the FBI revealed that Hinn's former chief financial officer, Gene Polino, allegedly embezzled $400,000 per week at one point. So I'm going to move away from that because that's something I could talk about along. One ideal way to smuggle dark money is via private aircraft, by boat, or by similar means. It's typically called bulk cash smuggling, as I was mentioning a minute ago about Apollo Quiboloy's jet. It makes it a crime to smuggle or attempt to smuggle more than $10,000 in currency or monetary instruments into or out of the U.S. with intent to avoid U.S. currency laws. Trinity Foundation, our group, our organization, tracks televangelist jets daily. We're tracking 62 jets on a daily basis with our Pastor Planes blog. Sometimes we get a few days behind. But we've observed flights to the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, Nevis, and other well-known tax haven nations over the years. One of our informants has a nickname for televangelist jets. He calls them laundry tubes, laundering money. So the televangelists he worked for smuggled stacks of cash from country to country and then back to the U.S. on his jet. Tons of money and jewels, mostly from the offering plate. When offerings were taken in other countries, this particular televangelist would personally gather some of the money and the best of the jewelry to keep for himself. On one occasion, the cash on this jet was stacked to the ceiling of the jet. On another occasion, this particular televangelist smuggled a bunch of valuable red rubies from the offering plate out of Russia on his jet, and our informant was detained and questioned by Russian authorities for 3 days about the rubies. Another televangelist jet was reportedly used for bringing hundreds of thousands of dollars into the country illegally, and on one occasion, gun running with machine guns. In the 1990s, a DEA informant reported a pallet stacked with cash in a Mexican airport destined for Haiti. The cash was thinly covered by televangelist Robert Tilton's brochures. This is a pallet of cash stacked. I'm going to go to shortly prior to the COVID pandemic, we reported bulk cash smuggling to the FBI by one large multinational church with hundreds of church locations in the Western Hemisphere, funneling money overseas out of the U.S. So that's something we reported to the FBI. But one of the problems with investigations by U.S. government agencies is the information only goes one way. We suggested we help in the year 2000. We were on a task force with the FBI, but they don't do that anymore. On multiple occasions, IRS officials have acknowledged the dark money problem in churches. In 2005, IRS Commissioner Mark Everson sent a letter to Senator Chuck Grassley claiming because churches were not required to file an informational return, we have little ability to monitor, we have little ability to monitor their operations against diversion of assets. In recent years, some of America's largest religious nonprofit institutions have been reclassified as churches to avoid reporting requirements. Billy Graham, man that's admired by many in this country, his association is now run by his son since he passed away, Franklin Graham, and they stopped filing the 990. So now that Franklin Graham operates a huge organization with $1 billion with a capital B going through Samaritan's Purse every year. He also runs the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, and there's no way of knowing how much salary he's also taking from that organization. Two other organizations, Gospel for Asia, GFA, and CRU, which is formerly named Campus Crusade for Christ, they no longer file the Form 990. And it's an imperfect form, but that at least it reveals the compensation to the highest paid individuals and the highest paid general contractors, such as lawyer firms and things like that, which Shruti is going to talk about shortly in her talk. But back to Senator Grassley's weekend inquiry in 2007. In 2011, he requested the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. Have any of you ever heard of that organization? Raise your hand. Okay, only a few. Called ECFA for short. ECFA, ECFA. They were told or asked by the senator to establish a commission to investigate all these reports that our foundation was sending to the Senate Finance Committee and about abused tax code loopholes. And the ECFA requires its members to be financially transparent on the surface. But in practice, they look the other way, and they rarely enforce their requirements. The ECFA requires its members to be financially transparent, as we said. But in this case, with this inquiry, they had dozens of individuals were appointed to the committee, and 6 of those individuals that were appointed to the committee were CPAs and lawyers for the very 6 organizations and I could name them: Kenneth Copeland Ministries, Creflo Dollar Ministries, Paula and Randy White Ministries, and I could go down the list, where these were people that worked for their organizations were hired to be on the committee to recommend what needed to be done. This is called regulatory capture, which has been covered by our panelists so far. That regulatory capture, or it's also called agency capture, it's also called state capture, and those, when the very people to be regulated end up taking control of the regulatory process, which has happened here with a number of organizations, governmental organizations here in the U.S. That, anyway, I could talk about that in a long time as well. But Benny Hinn hired 2 former IRS commissioners, speaking of regulatory capture, Larry Gibbs and Fred Goldberg, to represent him during the Senate inquiry into the misuse of donor funds. And anyway, dark money buys influence, as you all know. And I'm using it as a more expansive term. Mostly, if you look in the dictionary, it's defined as religious money that influences politics. I'm using it in a broader sense because all the money in churches and religious organizations in the U.S. is dark in a sense. It goes unreported, and any reporting is voluntary, as we talked about. So last month, Kenneth Copeland, one of the people that was investigated by Senator Grassley, he flew on his church-owned jet to West Palm Beach, Florida, to join Trump's entourage in Trump's 757 jet flying to Pennsylvania, where Copeland prayed at a campaign rally on behalf of Senate candidate Dr. Oz. So, should these aircraft receive a tax exemption? Obviously not. The IRS needs to investigate and provide guidance on inappropriate uses of non-commercial aircraft. Ministry's dark money even reaches a politician sometimes. According to one of our informants, a nonprofit religious TV network would give money to employees to illegally donate to politicians. These are called straw donors as well, which was talked about in one of our plenaries earlier today. So what can be done about the problems of church and ministry financial abuses? We came up with a short, multi-pronged approach necessary to address the growing decline of financial transparency and the increase of dark money in religious institutions. Number 1, increase the financial transparency in religious institutions, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Number 2, amend laws to provide greater access to financial data such as SARS. Number 3, educate the public regarding donor responsibility. Of course, if you're responsible and you have nothing to look at, that's a huge problem. Churches and ministries must be required to file a Form 990. And as such, there could be a 990 designed for them called a 990R, 990 religious, for churches, synagogues, and mosques, which discloses total revenue, total expenses, and compensation of executives. Congress should amend both the 1974 Privacy Act and the Bank Secrecy Act to allow for the release of information in the public interest. For example, both for-profit and not-for-profit corporations should be required to submit to increased scrutiny by the public. These are not private persons. Corporations are not private persons. They're man-made entities. Additionally, nonprofit companies should not be allowed to form shell companies, limited liability companies, or shadow companies. We regularly meet with a particular individual in the IRS who he's disgusted by the fact that some churches are now filing and creating limited liability companies to limit their liability. Law enforcement agencies and regulatory agencies should provide status to whistleblowers. We heard this today about all the people being murdered and imprisoned. Currently, when Trinity Foundation submits a complaint to the IRS is prohibited from revealing if an audit or criminal investigation has been launched or closed or even existed. In the rare cases the IRS revokes the tax-exempt status of a nonprofit, the IRS sends the organization a revocation letter, which is confidential. Those should not be confidential. These letters should be available via FOIA requests to journalists and donors so they can see if an organization used donations to pay any penalties. The U.S. Congress could also take a cue from Australia's external standards for nonprofit organizations. Australia requires nonprofit organizations, including churches, to disclose how funds are spent when they are used in foreign countries. By the way, after this presentation, we're going to publish this on our website, so that will be available if people want to check. One example, Hillsong Church Australia, they were informed that they can't that sending cash to Romanian individuals would be reported. They sidestepped their Australian law and simply went through the U.S. through Hillsong Global LLC, limited liability, an American church-related company. If Hillsong Global had filed a 990 or would file a 990, that would disclose this kind of transaction. There's complete opacity. The system is broken down. It's not working. With these legal changes, greater transparency would reduce the ability of churches and ministries to launder money and illegally buy political influence. The time to act, it's time to act now. All right.
Shruti, what's your perspective on that?
Thank you, Hazel. Thank you, everyone, for persevering here and staying here till the last panel. Really appreciate it. And I wanted to say to Giannina that you inspired me to set up a church for anti-corruption and transparency. So maybe I'll do that. So a little bit about me, just so you understand why I'm on this panel with these amazing people, because that's really my question to Hazel. I was really confused about why she wanted me on the panel. So I'm a CEO of a nonprofit organization, Coalition for Integrity. I know a little bit about the compliance requirements for a genuine nonprofit organization. Secondly, I'm on the board of another nonprofit organization, Partnership for Transparency Fund, and I'm also the chair of the audit committee. So again, I know a little bit about financial controls and really how a well-run nonprofit should carry on its business. By background, I'm a forensic accountant, so I'm a chartered accountant, I'm a CPA, and I'm a certified fraud examiner. So with that out of the way, I also want to mention I grew up in India. So if anyone here from India, by the way? Yay. So you will know exactly what I'm talking about, because religion in India is intertwined in our lives. It plays an important part in our lives. And religious leaders are really seen as gods, almost as gods. They hold tremendous power in society. Religious organizations in India and in the rest of the world do tremendous work. I mean, they serve the needy. But along with that, there is a dark side. There's financial opacity, there's a complete lack of transparency, which allows a lot of ills to kind of pass through them. They hide money laundering, or they facilitate money laundering. They hide conflicts of interest. The religious leader is able to enrich himself at the expense of the congregation. And also investment advisors at churches and other places also enrich themselves. When an Indian godman died in 2011, his name was Satya Sai Baba, and when he died, his assets were $9.1 billion. Wow, for a person who'd renounced life and just devoted his life to God, that's an awful amount of money. And then, again, there is another Indian godman right now called Baba Ramdev. He runs a side business, and it brings in about $1.6 billion in annual turnover. Again, no taxes paid. And apparently, I hear from my Indian friends that the products are also substandard. So that's another thing. Now, I want to address a little bit of what Pete said. If you want tax-exempt status as a church or as a nonprofit in the US, you have to apply for a 501c3 status. And really, it means that you cannot engage in partisan political activity, really, to get that status. You should not indulge in lobbying. You can't enrich a private person at the expense of many, and you really should carry on what you're supposed to be doing, like your religious mission or your educational mission or the mission of your nonprofit. And a tax-exempt status has many benefits. For example, as an organization, you don't have to pay taxes. A person who donates to you gets tax exemption. Many times you get discounted services from various other organizations. For example, my organization uses QuickBooks, which is a tax software. There's a special rate for nonprofits. We take benefit for that. So there are lots of benefits to be a tax-exempt organization. One of the things, if you're a nonprofit, you have to do is you have to file a 990, which again, Pete, you mentioned, Anne mentioned. A 990 provides a great deal of financial information. It's on the, you can find an 990 on the organization's website. ProPublica publishes it, and again, it's publicly available. But a 990 gives you a lot of financial and non-financial information about the organization. It tells you about the organization's mission. It tells you what the top paying employees earn. It also tells you who your top donors are, where you're spending your money. So again, there's a lot of information you can find on the 990. It's not a perfect form, but it takes a lot of effort to file it, and certainly it provides a lot of information about the organization. Now, churches, religious organizations don't have to file a 990. Depending on the laws of the state that you are registered in, if you're a registered entity, you may or may not be required to have audited financials, which really means as a church, you may not actually be required to be audited. Your financials may not require to be audited. You don't have to hire an independent auditor always. And given that I've done some investigations into nonprofit organizations in my past life, I can also say that lots of nonprofit and religious organizations have very, very weak financial controls. They often don't have a strong board. If they do have a board, an independent board, they don't have a financial expert on the board. And if they have that, they actually do not disclose anything about their donors, so you do not actually know who's giving them money. They disclose nothing about where they are spending money, so there's no disclosure about the expenditure either. And certainly, even the well-meaning ones don't actually do any due diligence on the identity of the donors or really who is giving them money. So they can even unwittingly be used for money laundering, even if they don't intend to be. They don't usually have a whistleblower policy. They, again, as I said, have no segregation in terms of management of money. So sometimes a person authorizing a financial transaction is the one who has access to the bank account and is cutting the check. So, and they certainly don't have any policies on conflicts of interest. I say all of that because it is easy to understand how some common schemes of fraud and corruption work in religious organizations. One example I'll give you, which is a common money laundering tool, is that you can give, a money launderer can give a huge donation to a religious organization. The religious organization obviously does not provide any disclosure on who its donors are. Then the religious organization, perhaps the pastor, the head of the church, the temple, will decide to take a 10% cut and then hire the person who's given him the money to provide services, fake services, and give the rest of the money back. So no services were truly provided, but you essentially laundered the money. Money laundering is the art of making dirty money appear clean. So essentially what you've done is you push the money through the church system or the religious organization system and given him now a check for services he's not really rendered, and the money's appeared clean. In countries such as India, religious organizations are also used by politicians because there are local rules on how much money you can spend and campaign finance disclosures you have to do. Guess what? You cut a check to a religious organization, the head of the church provides bribes, other things to the local population, and you get people to vote for you, and everybody knows it's you behind the money. In many countries, companies have corporate social responsibility budgets. In India, companies have to spend about 2% of their net profits on an average of 3 years on essentially benefiting society, so on corporate social responsibility activities. And religious organizations are included in that non-profit world. So you can write a check to a non-profit or you can write a check to a religious organization. It's quite common for a company to write a check to a religious organization and then, wink, nod, you get 90% of the money back. Maybe the religious organization takes a 10% cut. And you'd think this is something that happens just in other places around the world. Of course not, as Anne mentioned, and as Pete has mentioned as well. Obviously, it happens in the US as well. I was reading up, because I wasn't sure why I'm on this panel, so I was reading up interesting cases, and I found out that last year a pastor in DC was arrested because he even defrauded the government. He applied and got PPP loans, and then he used the money to buy luxury cars. Wow, I'm driving a Honda Fit, so that car is like a golf cart. Someone laugh at my jokes. Earlier this year, a rabbi was also sentenced. His synagogue took in $6 million in donations, I would say fake donations, and he took a 10% cut and he returned 90% of the money back to the donors. And the donors obviously took a full tax deduction for the amount that they donated. And he also got companies to match the donations. I mean, I don't know what he was doing, all kinds of things, all kinds of frauds. The sad part in all of this is churches themselves and religious organizations themselves are also often subject to fraud. And apparently 60% of these of fraud at these churches goes unreported. When my investigator friends, friends who still work at accounting firms and do financial investigations, I've talked to them about it. They've said that when they go in to do an investigation, they're met with so much resistance. People don't want to turn over any kind of financial records. They don't want to turn over any paperwork. It's really astonishing. And financial records are also not well maintained. When you donate money to a nonprofit organization, you actually look on their website, you see what it is you're doing. Maybe if you're like me, you're looking at their 990. But when people give money to churches and religious organizations in millions, nobody's doing any due diligence. The donors are not doing any due diligence. I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to also say one thing, which in the US, actual attendance at churches is also declining. And this should, what we're discussing today about best practice standards for churches and really money laundering in churches should not just be an issue for anti-corruption activists. It should also be an issue for religious and pious people, because unless you root this out, millennials and the new generation are not going to want to attend churches, temples, synagogues, really anything, because they really demand accountability and they want to see the impact of their money even when they are donating. So that's one point I'd want to make, but I'm going to pass it over to.
So basically, you heard that we have a broken system. It has turned churches into the perfect vehicles to launder money and to commit all sorts of financial crime. And we also have organized criminals and corrupt politicians and a lot of other actors who know it and are using it. So they're having a party. And it is not a mystery how to fix it. We already know how to regulate NGOs. We know how to go after money launderers. We just have a gap in this broader system, right? But two problems. On the one hand, these groups have developed an incredible amount of political influence. They are, in some cases, political actors themselves. In Latin America, they have become political parties who win elections and are sitting in Congress and have enormous blocks making decisions. Number two, even when you do have regulations, oftentimes nobody wants to touch them because you don't want to be accused of persecuting religion, or you don't want to be the person who's saying that your pastor or a nun or anybody who is supposed to be somebody in a community is corrupt. And when I think Pete alluded to this, when you start asking tough questions, there's very few people, for example, who go to churches who want to ask for explanations on how that money is being used. And when you do, and I know Pete mentioned to me at some point a long time ago, he did ask in a church, and he was cordially invited to go to a different church. And so we have a situation where culturally we are not even there yet, and this is probably why we are still having this situation. So before we go to the audience, I am another point that Giannina made is journalists, where in some cases there's investigations and it go very deep, but when it comes to covering this on a regular basis, there is no coverage. In fact, one of the things that I focused a lot when I was doing my PhD is how the media covers religion, and what I'm finding is that even in the face of blatant disinformation, the press tends to not only not fact check disinformation, but actually to amplify it. So when you don't have any of the regular accountability mechanisms working for this one actor, of course is going to become not just a perfect vehicle for corruption, but also a very powerful one with a lot of friends and hands in government. So with that beautiful picture painted, and before we go to the audience, because I would love to hear people from different countries, what is the situation in your countries with this? How do we fix this? And maybe we can go around the table, and I know it's not an easy question, but we do have to start somewhere. So,
Well, I wanted to pick up on Giannina's point about Pentecostal churches and mega churches and non-denominational churches, which those three categories have a lot of overlap. And as somebody who grew up in a mainline Protestant church and had relatives in every imaginable denomination, I recently started looking at how these churches are distinct. And at least, the Southern Baptist Convention has had a lot of problems, which we all know about. But it also does have a leadership that has recently been held accountable for some of these problems. What you have in the non-denominational churches is that anybody can say, I'm a bishop. No seminary, no oversight. You just can state that you are clergy. And I've been looking into some of these churches in my research and found that there are very prominent pastors who are speaking for their demographic, their religious grouping on CNN and Fox and ABC, and you look up the address of their church, and it's a hotel room on the interstate. I'm not kidding. I was shocked, and so, I thought, my goodness, that is like the simplest bit of journalism you can possibly do. Look up the address, and yet they're given this political credibility, and I now want to go back to that list of people who receive money from the foundations and see whether that so-called church is getting grants. And I think that Pete summed it up very well. You just need oversight from the government, from the IRS, but also, I'm thinking that journalism should have a religious financial beat. Like the Wall Street Journal should have a religious business page, because that's what's going on.
Thank you, Anne, because that's exactly, I think Pete already summarized on the regulatory stage, there's so much to do. At the very least, churches should report, their file a 990 at the very least, I think, if you ask me. But the thing is more complicated than that. And one of the things, and I'm gonna, my frustration as a professional, as a person, after 3 years investigating this, I became seriously sick because there are the victims don't recognize themselves as victims. And we're talking about, I had a source who was helping one of these churches involved in money laundering to do everything in one of the branches. She was threatened. It's a terror story, terrific, horrible story, because nobody, the moment they know, it's very organized. The moment they know a member is speaking out, the organization goes against these people in ways that I was never imagined. So I think I'm going to add what Anne just said. I was seriously, in the first part of the investigation, the political one, I was really, as a foreigner living in the US, I was really surprised to see how journalists were not even interested in, religion is not in the equation, in spite of the fact that religion is the invisible pillar that integrates politics, the business, and everything together. It's just that we're not seeing one part of the puzzle that is very, very important. So I think not only religious business, I think religion as, for instance, the visits all these religious people did to the Middle East, where nobody's tracking what they do, nobody's, except for the Trinity Foundation and a few others. But I think more awareness, more interest, more funding to investigate this also, it's important. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to quote Eleanor Roosevelt, our former First Lady, one of the greatest First Ladies ever. She said in her book, Tomorrow is Now, in the final analysis, democratic government represents the sum total of integrity and courage of its individuals. It cannot be more than them. I say that because we all have to demand accountability. If your congregation demands accountability, maybe the church will do it. If you demand accountability, maybe our leaders in government will require the 990 to be filed. And we all should demand more transparency. Even with the 990, I don't think just that level of financial information is enough. I do think there's more required. I think you need disclosure of the ultimate donors of money to these churches. It's not enough to say Americans for Transparency or Americans for Prosperity. You need to know who the ultimate donor is, which I think is very, very difficult to get to, but I think that's what's required, because you wouldn't get to dark money unless you know that. So again, require them to file a 990, require them to have an independent audit, require them to have disclosure of the ultimate donors, require strong financial controls. I mean, I think we should all expect that. We expect that from well-run nonprofits, so I think we should expect that them from religious organizations as well. And I think we should encourage investigative journalists like Giannina and really review their work, use their work, tweet about it, talk about it to raise awareness. I think that's what's lacking too. Thank you.
Thank you, Shruti. I may have mentioned it, but the IRS is understaffed, overwhelmed. Regulatory capture happens within the IRS as well. The one thing I wanted to correct is that most people are under the impression that if you want a tax exemption, you have to file for a 501c3, but that's not entirely accurate. If you call yourself a church, you are automatically given a 501c3 status. In a sense, you're not. You can be a church. You can file for a 501c3, but in either case, whether you file for it or not, your donors, the money they give is tax exempt, and your organization is tax exempt. So it's even more unregulated than some of us were saying. The investigations that the IRS do are rare, and they're driven by the IRS lawyers. And let me explain real quick. When we, Trinity Foundation, we meet with the exempt organization division of the IRS, the manager, and he has explained to us that the lawyers, if they're going to take a case, they want to be able to win that case outright before they even take a case. So we may recommend an audit that may be rejected by the IRS lawyers because it's not worth the money that they might get back from that organization, or because they feel like, because the organization is a religious organization, that if it ever went to court, there at least one juror it would be a hung jury in a sense, and they couldn't get a conviction. So the lawyers are driving the IRS investigations. First they form a committee, then they once they get a recommendation for an investigation, that goes through the committee. And if the committee wants to send it to the lawyers, then it goes to the lawyers. As I said, the system is broken. I'm ready to answer any questions, and I'm sure anybody else is here.
Thank you so much. So thanks so much for staying past the time. This is the first panel where I see everybody staying decidedly. So I know we have one question here and then one there. There is a microphone there, and they have asked us if everybody can go to the mic just for recording purposes. Thank you. And please say who you are and also who specifically you're addressing your question to.
To the journalist. My name is Maria Cristina. I know very well how Brazilian works. I was married to Valdemar Costa Neto, who is the president of PL, Partido Liberal, where all the bishops from Igreja Universal were. I denounced him and other politicians. I am a whistleblower. I sent them all to jail for corruption. But what it is like there's something very weird going on in the United States with the Brazilian church. There's 67 new churches after Bolsonaro, from Fort Lauderdale to Orlando. The wife of Bolsonaro created even a consulate in Orlando. And she's the one who does this with the pastors. Why? They get visas to stay in the United States, and they're doing a thing that basically she helps them to go to the Brazilian companies in the United States and make them donate cesta básica. I don't know what's the name of it in English. It's the basic needs to these churches, but they never passed what it is. So they're doing two criminal things in Florida. They have 63 new churches. Every mall has a new Brazilian church. And they created a consulate in Orlando with a former employee of Michel Bolsonaro, who uses all the evangelic churches to do politics. That's what they do, basically. And this woman goes with these pastors to the Brazilian companies and asks for money for cesta básica, which is like a box with the basic needs, but they don't give away. So they are making what we call in Brazil rachadinha with all these churches, and nobody investigates this. So it's completely absurd. I know how it makes, I know how they go, because I saw this in Brazil, but what they are doing here, they're committing 2 or 3 frauds. Visa fraud, money laundering, and it's absurd. So it's in the United States. So I want to know who are the journalists who can investigate this, because I'm not a journalist, but it has to do with the President Bolsonaro's family and the structure he created here in the United States.
Maria Cristina. Maria Cristina, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. I wish I could answer who's going to be the next one to investigate. We know Universal Church is one of the largest churches, international churches in the world.
Do you know how he paid his apartment? $8 million.
We're talking about
a TV box full of money.
The second largest media outlet in Brazil is owned by him.
Yeah.
He was investigated on money laundering, and because of his political connections, well, that's the only. I cannot say that expressly, but he, after several years and with enough evidence, the cases were dismissed, and. Because of what I was talking about before.
No, but this is not the Igreja Universal. This is like every little mall in Florida has a church with the name of whatever it is.
So when we were investigating the church, is not in Brazil. They have more than 1,000 branches all over the world, not only in the U.S. And just to give you an example, one of these small churches has 3 branches in Reykjavik. I mean, there are only 300,000 people in Iceland, And there were 3 branches of those churches in Reykjavik. I mean, more than the people. So
Check.
it's huge. The work that has to be done is huge. You have to literally go use, satellite pictures, but literally go to to those branches, go and see who is attending, if anybody. And but it's like auditing something that is not allowed to be
in
audited.
Brazil,
it's impossible.
it's the list is on the consulate.
For journalists, it's really difficult. I mean, what Anne did was thanks to having access to public records in 990s. But what we cannot see because of the lack of regulation is probably huge. So I think in the U.S. in particular, because you're asking, I think it's very important for the rest of the world that the U.S. fixes this problem.
Yeah.
Because it's exporting the problem to every other country in the world.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah, we have 2 more questions, then we go with you, Pete. And I think there was somebody in the back, so let's just take those 2 and we wrap up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Agbaji Orinya from Nigeria. I just want to ask this question to the journalists. In the course of your work, from all you have said so far, we've heard a lot of heartbreaking stories, Don't you find anything positive? Have you not found any church doing something positive or anything good you can report from these churches? In Nigeria, my organization is called Palace of Priests Assembly, is the name of the church, where we have a social arm called the Peace and Justice Initiative. We are currently implementing a project mobilizing Christians against corruption in Nigeria. We started this project in 2018. When we started the project, of course, we were met with a lot of resistance from the church. We are focusing on the Pentecostal community. But they said, look, don't talk about corruption in the church. And the reason is simple. Many of them are already involved in all kinds of corruption, including money laundering. But as we speak, we have been able to successfully mobilize many pastors, many Pentecostal pastors in Nigeria who are currently in the fight against corruption. In fact, in the last 1 year, we were able to train about 1,700 Pentecostal pastors who are currently actively involved in the fight against corruption. So what we're saying is, can't we also find some of these churches who are doing some good things and also report to at least encourage other churches to do the same thing? If you look at our accountability framework that we use in the church, we also try as much as possible to promote it, all right, so that other churches can also adopt this framework and work with it. Every year, we employ the services of independent auditors who come to audit our account. They don't only audit our account, we publish this account. We publish these audited accounts. So there are churches who are also doing similar things. So I'm just thinking that while we also report the negative side, let us also draw our attention or focus on the positive things that some churches are also doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let's go with the last question, and then we go with Pete and the whole panel.
Hello, thank you for your interesting presentations. I'm an Inga Sprinje, investigative reporter from Latvia. It's Baltic countries in Eastern Europe, in other side of the world. My question is maybe to Anne more. You were showing there was the list with that, where also these American conservative groups have given money to Africa. My question is what's the goal? When Russia is giving money to different organizations in our region, I know the goal is to split society, to get their traditional value ideology. So that's why I would like to know when Americans are giving to Africa, what's their goal, what they want to achieve, and have you also observed that they are doing the same like in Europe? And again, what's the goal of doing that? Okay, thank you.
Well, I think that in terms of Africa and what I've seen in Central America too, it's wanting influence, although the influence can come along with some economic interests. I talked to some evangelicals who basically took over an entire town in Guatemala and told the mayor that they'd build them an urban recreation center and pity hall and everything if they basically let them run the town. And so in some of these countries there are natural resource interests. There's also the interest in just power. And I do want to say that the Council for National Policy and a lot of the evangelical organizations associated with it have been very close to the Russian Orthodox Church and through them to Putin for several decades. And some of the organizations have branches in Russia. And you can see signs that they are trying to advocate for Russia against Ukraine right now. So that's an area I'm very concerned about at this point, but I think that everywhere they're involved, they can cause problems.
Giannina, and then we wrap up with Pete.
I totally agree with you. Thank you for giving us the good news that there are churches organized and training their pastors and leaders to, become more transparent. And I'm pretty sure, the subject of my investigation was money laundering, so I focused on that, but I'm pretty sure that the majority, as Pete and all of us said, of churches, or most of them are doing things like that. And I think and if you ask me who has to do something about all this problem, all of us, because it's a problem of society, but primarily the good churches, I would say, because who wants to have these bad actors inside your, the umbrella of religion? So, it's a good initiative.
Pete, go ahead.
I don't think my mic is live anymore. Thank you. I don't have a lot to say. I wanted to mention something to the woman that walked out about investigating those churches for the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God in Brazil. We've been looking at them for a long time, and I would like to get. If anybody knows her, I would like to get in touch with her. But that's good enough for now.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much.
Actually, I do have one other thing. I'm sorry.
Just a suspense at the end.
If anybody knows, one of our informants is on the run in Malaysia. She was an informant for a church, a large church in the Philippines, and she fears for her life. There was a reporter murdered, a journalist murdered 2 months ago in October that was reporting on the large church, and now that this church helped get Duterte elected, and now recently Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bong Bong Marcos, they helped him get elected as well, and this journalist was murdered, and she fears for her life. She believes they've located her whereabouts in Malaysia. If anybody, I've tried for a couple of years now to try to help her get asylum, writing letters. If anybody knows of a method to help me, please let me know.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Pete. Well, thank you all so much for staying until so late, and thank you so much for your panelists as well for these very interesting presentations. Thank you. Good night.